Hello, my name is Joseph. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh in political theory, and my presentation is entitled The Corporation as a Social Fact and as a Social Group. Here's a rough outline. I begin by quickly pointing at a controversy about corporate responsibility that motivates my discussion in this presentation. My main aim will be to problematize two perhaps simplified ontological conceptions of corporations that underlie many of our theories about corporate responsibility. I think that corporations are commonly theorized either as social facts or social groups. However, neither the social fact nor the social group view of corporations can adequately explain corporate responsibility. Thus, we need a way of reconciling the two views and theorizing corporations as both social facts and social groups. The problem is that extant ontological conceptions of corporations seem unable to do this. But I think there is an ontological framework that can help us out. And this is Brian Epstein's ontological framework of grounding and anchoring social facts. So I will try and briefly indicate how Epstein's framework might be utilized when thinking about corporate responsibility. There is much debate over the question of what kinds of responsibility corporations can have and what the content of their responsibilities should be. One long-standing and important debate is whether corporations can count as moral agents and bear moral responsibilities. A classic libertarian position, famously defended by Chicago school economist Milton Friedman, is that corporations are artificial persons and therefore only have artificial, that is, legal but not moral responsibilities. Similarly, Michael Jensen and William Mackling write that corporations are nothing but legal fictions, hence they can be, I quote, no more responsible than a lump of coal. But it is not only these classic libertarian positions. Much of the literature on what is called corporate social responsibility also departs from the assumption that the locus of responsibility is the manager rather than the corporation itself. In contrast to this, various theorists such as Peter French, Philip Pettit, and Christian List, as well as Candy Hass and Stephanie Collins, have defended the moral agency and moral responsibility of corporations, arguing that corporations can form their own intentions, beliefs, etc. At the core of this controversy about the moral responsibility of corporations is the ontological question of what corporations are. And I think that this question has been approached in two different ways, resulting in two different views of corporate responsibility. My contention lies in the common theorization of corporations either as social facts or social groups. For example, John Searle conceives of the corporation as a social fact. But this will mean that corporations are theorized in the same way as, say, a marriage, a handicapped parking spot, or a dollar bill. For Searle, these things come into being by way of a certain status ascription. But interestingly, in the case of corporations, Searle's constitutive rule, X counts as Y in C, has a freestanding Y term, meaning that there is no pre-existing X that counts as Y. Hence, for Searle, we create corporations out of thin air, as it were, by saying something equivalent to, let there be a corporation. In contrast to this, Christian List and Philip Pettit, for example, conceive of the corporation as a social group. They see corporations as being constituted by group agents. Group agency is achieved through a collective level decision-making procedure that produces collective intentions, beliefs, or reasons that cannot be reduced to the intentions, beliefs, and reasons of individual members, and therefore must be attributed to the corporation itself. Moreover, a group agent is a moral agent if it can attend to moral considerations, and corporations are seen as a prime example of a collective moral agent, as they have systematic decision procedures in place that can attend to moral considerations. A consequence of these two common ways of theorizing corporations is that they are often viewed either as social or legal constructs, but independent of their group agency, or as group agents, but independent of their social or legal status. Accordingly, corporations bear responsibilities that pertain to their institutional status, but that reduce to the individual role obligation of managers, or corporations bear irreducible collective moral responsibilities that derive from their collective moral agency, but not from their institutional status. So this means that corporate responsibilities are often theorized in the same way as the responsibilities of other non-incorporated group agents. I believe that an adequate theory of corporate responsibility needs to reconcile these two views. It needs to recognize the collective moral agency of corporations and go beyond conceptions of individual managerial role obligation. At the same time, however, it needs to go beyond conceptions of collective moral responsibility and recognize that corporations are not just groups, but social institutions whose actions are enabled through and constrained by their institutional status as well as the institutional structure that is characteristic of them. This means that an adequate theory of corporations reconciles their competing theorizations as social facts and social groups. What seems lacking, however, is an ontological conception of corporations that can successfully explain corporations as both social institutions and group agents. Some attempts have been made in this direction, but they do not seem entirely convincing. Frank Hendricks, for example, contends that corporations can be both at the same time social integrates, that is, groups with internal decision procedures that form collective agents in the way that List and Pettit and other theorists describe it, and what he calls corporate agents, which are groups that have a certain status which is externally ascribed to them and which can also make for their agency. Hendricks calls this the internal and external perspective on collective agency, which I think broadly maps onto what I've been calling the social group and social fact view. So I agree with Hendricks' analysis, and I think that his analysis is helpful in that it recognizes both the group agency as well as the institutional status of corporations. But Hendricks doesn't really tell us how the internal and external perspective relate to one another, how internal decision procedures and external status ascriptions might interrelate to bring about corporate agency, and how social structures might shape this corporate agency. Tony Lawson, on the other hand, conceptualizes corporations as emergent, socially positioned communities. So Lawson too recognizes the institutional status of corporations. What he calls social positioning is similar to Searle's ascription of status functions. And speaking of communities, Lawson also recognizes that corporations are groups that can potentially form a group agent, though Lawson is not concerned with questions of group agency. However, the problem in Lawson's ontological conception of corporations is, I think, his notion of emergence. Lawson holds that facts about social entities emerge from facts about their components and their internal relational organizing. However, many important facts about corporations do not depend only on or emerge only from facts about the people who work for a corporation and the internal relationships between them. They also depend on facts that are external to the corporation. Consider the fact that someone is the CEO of a corporation. This fact does not depend on the members of the corporation and their internal relationships alone, since usually a CEO is elected by shareholders who are external to the corporation. Catherine Ritchie addresses this problem at proposing a structuralist conception of groups. Ritchie is not concerned specifically with corporations, but more generally with organized groups. For her, organized groups are characterized by structures where individuals realize these structures through the occupation of positions and roles. Moreover, organized group structures are social structures, meaning that they can only be defined by social factors such as intentions, practices, rules, laws, norms, arrangements, etc. And these social factors can be both internal and external to organized groups. Hence, the organized ways in which people work together in a group depends not only on group members and their internal relationships, but also on how the group structure is formed by external social factors. Yet what seems to go missing in Ritchie's conception of organized groups is the institutional status that some organized groups, such as corporations, have, and that is central to understanding the agency and responsibility. Now, I do not have an answer to the ontological question of what kind of entity exactly corporations are and how best to conceptualize them. As I mentioned, I think there are a few desiderata of an adequate ontological conception of corporations. It should recognize their institutional status, be able to explain their agency, and take into account the wider social structures that shape the corporate institutional form, and with it, their ways of decision-making and realizing their agency. So perhaps with a few tweaks, the ontological conceptions of corporations given by Hendricks, Lawson, or Ritchie might be able to achieve this. But rather than providing a new ontological conception of corporations here, I want to focus on the question of corporate agency and responsibility and suggest looking at these questions through the lens of Brian Epstein's ontological framework of grounding and anchoring social facts. I think that Brian Epstein, in his 2015 book, The End Trap, provides an ontological framework that allows us to capture the diverse set of facts that underpin corporate agency and responsibility. To explain this in a little bit more detail and connect it to what I've said before, Epstein identifies two competing views about the social world, which he terms the standard model of social ontology and the consensus view, respectively. In a nutshell, the standard model is the assumption that the social world is a product of our collective intentions. This is the assumption that underlies Searle's theory of social ontology, for example. And the consensus view is the assumption of ontological individualism as a claim about supervenience. So List and Pettit's theory of group agency builds on this assumption. I think that the social fact and the social group view of corporations reflect the standard model and the consensus view. However, Epstein notices some problems with the standard model and the consensus view. First of all, they seem to describe two different kinds of facts about the social world. The standard model describes facts such as, this piece of paper is a $20 bill, that part of the road is a handicapped parking spot, or this person is the President of the United States. The consensus view, on the other hand, says that collective level facts supervene on facts about individuals. They are exhaustively determined by them. So if we fix all facts about a group's members, all facts about the group are fixed as well. This brings us to a second issue that Epstein points at, namely the individualism that is built into the consensus view, but also the standard model. But when discussing Tony Lawson above already, we saw that there are some facts about some groups, such as corporations, that cannot be adequately be described only by reference to the individual members of these groups together with their internal organizing. So Epstein presents an alternative ontological framework for explaining and understanding social facts, which allows us to relate to another and distinguish between the different kinds of facts that the standard model and the consensus view mean to explain. Concurrently, his framework is no longer committed to individualism about the social world. Epstein builds on the notions of grounding and anchoring social facts. These are both metaphysical dependence relations that explain how social facts obtain. So to say that fact A grounds fact B means to say that A metaphysically makes it the case that B. And the anchoring relation is, or describes what makes it the case that a grounding relation holds between two facts. This is a much deeper metaphysical relation that explains the mechanisms how social facts are produced, for instance through collective intentions or collective agreements. The grounding relation can explain the kinds of facts that the consensus view means to explain, whereas anchoring explains the facts that the standard model means to explain. In other words, through the language of grounding and anchoring, we can explain in one ontological framework the facts that the social fact and the social group view of corporations mean to explain. So let me illustrate this with corporations. So when thinking about corporations, we can distinguish between two kinds of facts. On the one hand, there are facts about the various people, such as employees and managers, who make up a corporation. Such facts include facts about their individual properties, their offices, roles, relationships, as well as their actions and interactions with people inside and outside the corporation. And such facts are grounds for the fact that a corporation acts in this or that way, that it forms an agent and bears responsibilities for its actions. Yet on the other hand, there are facts about corporate laws, competitive markets, historical developments, social norms, and so on, that determine how a corporation comes into existence, how it is constituted, and how it reaches decisions. These facts that we collectively accept corporations as entities that we can do business with, that the laws specify the requirements for incorporation and also specify a certain corporate structure. These are not grounds, but anchors. These facts anchor facts about how a corporation is set up and as a social institution, how a corporation can act, and how it can have responsibilities. We can say that the structured ways in which employees and managers of a corporation work together ground the fact that they form a responsible group agent. The fact that something is the outcome of a corporate decision-making procedure grounds the fact that this something is a corporate decision, intention, belief, or the like, for which the corporation is responsible. But the ways in which corporations come into existence, as well as the ways in which corporate decision procedures are set up and institutionalized, are anchored by facts that are in part external to corporate members. These facts involve the laws about incorporation, the functioning of competitive markets, historical developments, and so on. So through the language of grounding and anchoring, it becomes possible in some way to reconcile the two different ways of theorizing corporations as social facts and social groups. We can recognize corporations as being constituted by groups of people where facts about these groups are grounded by facts about their members, by facts about outsiders, and by other social facts. And where the conditions for facts about corporations to obtain are anchored by facts that regulate incorporation, corporate statuses, roles, rights, responsibilities, etc. Finally, then, to come back to the beginning of this presentation and the debate about corporate responsibility, I think we can utilize Epstein's ontological framework to capture the diverse set of facts that ground and anchor corporate responsibility, including their collective agency, their institutional status, social structures, and other social facts that are internal or external to the corporation. In addition to this, we can work out the grounds and anchors for different forms of corporate responsibility. For example, attributions of moral responsibility to corporations will be grounded in facts about their collective agency and their actions and interactions with other agents. However, the grounds for corporate moral responsibility do not necessarily include facts about their institutional status, but then there are other responsibilities of corporations that might be grounded in their institutional status, but not necessarily in their collective agency, since they might reduce to individual role obligations of managers. One example of this are corporate legal responsibilities, which are grounded in the fact that corporations are legal persons. And other examples include the claim that corporations have ethical responsibilities, for example, to advance economic efficiency, because this is why We want corporations to exist in the first place. I will end with this. I look forward to your input on this, and thank you for listening. A big thanks also to the organizers of this conference.